The smoke appeared before anyone understood what it meant. Thin, gray, rising from a place where nothing should have been burning. No cabin stood on that hillside, no shed, no lean-to, no structure of any recognizable kind. Just a long, quiet slope of frozen grass and scattered stone, the kind of land a man rides past without looking twice because there is nothing there worth looking at. The hill faced south and west, and in the mornings the frost caught the light in a way that made the whole slope look pale and empty and indifferent. And yet every morning, just after dawn, the smoke returned. It rose in a single thin column, steady, unhurried, as if whatever produced it was in no particular rush. It did not gust or flicker with the wind. It simply rose and then dispersed, and then was gone by mid-morning, and the hill returned to looking like nothing at all. The men of Harlan's Ridge noticed it first the way men always notice things that interrupt the expected. A rancher named Cobb Weller saw it on a Tuesday while checking his eastern fence line. He stopped his horse, tilted his head, and looked for a full minute before deciding he had imagined it. Then he saw it again the next morning from a different angle, and he could not explain it away so easily. Others confirmed it in the days that followed. The farrier's boy mentioned it to his father. A woman hanging washing in the cold saw it and told her husband, who told two other men at the feed store, who both said they had already noticed but hadn't said anything because there was nothing sensible to say. There was no structure on that hill. Everyone in Harlan's Ridge knew that hill. It had been empty as long as anyone could remember. Empty before the town existed. Empty before the road cut through empty in the way that certain pieces of land simply remain empty because nothing about them invites a person to stay. And yet something was burning up there. Controlled, consistent, deliberate. The town talked about it the way small towns talk about unexplained things. First with curiosity, then with irritation, then with the particular unease that settles in when a question refuses to answer itself. A man named Prescott said it was marsh gas rising from underground. Another man said there was no marsh on that hill and never had been. The argument did not produce a conclusion because no one was willing to climb up and look. Not yet, not in the first days of that winter when the cold had already turned serious and the hill was a 40-minute ride in the wrong direction. So the smoke remained, and the town watched it each morning briefly, then turned back to the work of surviving the season. What the town did not connect, not immediately, was that the smoke had appeared roughly 3 weeks after Agnes Merrow walked away from her property on the eastern edge of town and did not come back. Agnes Merrow was 64 years old in the autumn of 1889, and she did not look like a woman accustomed to difficulty because she had spent 40 years making sure no one could tell. She was a compact woman, narrow-shouldered but not frail, with hands that had done real work for most of her adult life and a face that had settled into an expression of patient attention, the kind of face that listens more than it speaks. Her hair had gone white at 50, and she had let it go because there were things worth spending energy on, and vanity had never ranked among them. She had lived in Harlan's Ridge since 1851, when she arrived as a young bride with a husband named Thomas Merrow and very little else. Thomas had been a decent man, not brilliant, not driven, but steady and honest and willing to work, which was more than could be said for most. They had built a life that was not remarkable in any way, except that it had lasted, which is its own kind of achievement. They raised cattle on 40 acres of leased land, then bought the land outright in 1863, and for 26 years the Merrow property was theirs in the way that things are yours, when you have paid for them in full and never stopped working to keep them. Thomas had a son from a first marriage, Dale. He had come to live with them when he was 14, awkward and resentful and difficult in the way that boys are difficult when they have been moved around too many times. Agnes had not warmed to Dale, and Dale had not warmed to Agnes, and over the years they had arrived at a kind of mutual toleration that passed for a relationship in a household where everyone was busy enough to avoid confrontation. Dale had left at 21, moved east, came back a few times infrequently for short visits that were always slightly formal and slightly strained, like conversations between people who share a language but not much else. He had married a woman named Vera, who was pleasant in the way that certain people are pleasant when they need something from you and have not yet decided what. Thomas died on a Thursday in early October, 1889. A stroke. He was there at breakfast and gone by noon. And the whole thing happened so fast that Agnes did not have time to prepare herself. which was unusual because Agnes Marrow had spent a considerable portion of her adult life preparing herself for things. Dale arrived 6 days later. Vera came with him. They stayed one night. The following morning, Dale placed a document on the kitchen table. Agnes looked at it. She did not pick it up. "This is a property conveyance," Dale said. "Father signed it 2 years ago. The property transfers to me upon his death." Agnes was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove made a small sound. Outside, the wind moved across the yard. "I see," she said. "You have no legal claim," Vera said. "Not cruelly, simply as a solement of fact, the way you might state that the sky was gray or the river was cold. The attorney in Casper has reviewed it. It's binding." Agnes looked at the document again. Then she looked at Dale. He did not meet her eyes. When she said, "We'd like to begin settling things before the hard freeze," Dale said. Agnes stood. She walked to the back of the house to the small room off the kitchen that she used for storage, and she opened the cedar chest in the corner and lifted out a canvas bag. She carried it to the front door. She put on her coat and her boots and her heaviest gloves. "That's all you're taking," Vera said. Agnes looked at her steadily. "It's all I need." She walked out. She did not look back at the house. This was not because she had no feeling about it. It was because she had already said what needed to be said inside herself quietly in the weeks before Thomas died, and the words were finished now, and there was nothing left to do but move. What neither Dale nor Vera knew, and what the town of Harlan's Ridge did not know, and what even Thomas had not fully understood, was that Agnes Marrow had been preparing for this day for 2 years. Not because she had known Thomas would die. She had not known that, not specifically. But she had known the situation was fragile in ways that were not visible on the surface, and Agnes Marrow had never been a woman who ignored what she could see simply because other people chose not to look. She had learned about the property document by accident 18 months before Thomas's death, when she found a duplicate copy filed incorrectly in a stack of papers she was organizing. She had read it carefully. She had sat with it for 3 days. Then she had folded it, put it back where she found it, and begun to think. She had not confronted Thomas. She had considered it and decided against it. Thomas was not a dishonest man, she believed that still, but he was a man who avoided conflict and made quiet decisions when he thought the outcome was already settled, and reopening that conversation would only have produced pain without changing the document. So she had chosen to work with what she knew rather than argue about what she could not change. Walt Pruitt had helped her see the alternative. Walt was an old man, 70-something. No one was entirely sure who had lived on the edge of the territory since before Harlan's Ridge was a town. He had arrived alone and remained alone, building and moving and building again, a man who understood land the way some people understand weather, not as something to be fought, but as something to be read. He had known Agnes since her first years in Wyoming, and he had taught her things over the years in the way that useful knowledge gets passed on not all at once, not formally, but in pieces during work, during long silences, during the particular conversations that happen between people who trust each other without making a ceremony of it. 2 years before Thomas died, Agnes had walked out to Walt's place on a cold October afternoon and told him what she was thinking. She had not asked for help. She had simply described what she understood about the hill to the west of town, the specific slope, the south-facing curve, the way the drainage ran, the depth of the frost line, the stone that surfaced naturally along the ridge. Walt had listened without interrupting. Then he had said, "I know that hill." He had taken her there that same afternoon. What he showed her was not visible to anyone who did not know what to look for. A slight irregularity in the slope, a section of ground that sounded different when you struck it, a fraction denser, a fraction more deliberate than the land around it. Walt had crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the earth and said nothing for a moment. "I started something here," he said finally. "Long time ago, before your town existed. I was going to winter through here one year, and then I didn't, and I left it." Agnes had looked at the ground. How far down? Far enough to matter. He stood slowly. "It's been sitting there ever since. Earth doesn't forget what's been done to it." She had understood then. Not just the practical meaning of what he was showing her, but the larger meaning. There was a foundation here, already begun, already partially shaped, waiting for someone to continue it. She had begun making her plans that same week. The canvas bag she carried out of the Marrow house contained tools, a short-handled spade, a folding saw, a fire kit, a coil of rope, a roll of oilcloth, dried meat, hardtack salt. She had assembled it slowly over 14 months, adding one item at a time, hiding it in plain sight among the storage in the back room. She had thought through every piece of it the way you think through a long journey when you have to carry everything yourself. She had also, on 3 separate occasions over the past 2 years, gone out to the hill at dawn and walked the ground alone, memorizing the slope, the drainage patterns, the location of the stone, the direction the wind came from, and how the curve of the hill affected it. She was not walking into the unknown. She was walking into something she had mapped in her mind 100 times, and the difference between those two things was everything. The walk from town to the hill took Agnes just over an hour. She moved slowly, not because she was afraid, but because the ground was uneven and the light was flat, and she was 64 years old with a loaded pack on her back, and hurrying served no purpose when no one was watching, and nothing was gained by arriving breathless. Her hands were cold before she reached the base of the hill. Her left knee, which had troubled her since 1882, made itself known on the uphill section. She stopped twice, not to rest exactly, but to look, to confirm what she already knew about the angle of approach, the position of the sun, the direction of the wind. There was a moment about halfway up when she stopped and stood still and let herself feel the full weight of what she was doing. She was a widow. She was 64. She had no family willing to take her and no savings of significance, no legal claim to the home she had spent 31 years building. The temperature would drop below zero within the week. She was standing on an empty hillside in Wyoming with a canvas bag and a plan that she had never tested at full scale. She was afraid, not panicked, not paralyzed, but genuinely, honestly afraid in the way that only honest people allow themselves to be afraid without flinching from it, without dressing it up as something else. She stood there and let the fear be real. Then she said very quietly to no one, "I don't know if I can do this, but I know what to do. And right now, that has to be enough." Then she kept walking. The digging began before noon on the first day. Agnes found the location by memory and by feel, pressing her boot heel into the ground at intervals until she found the section. Walt had identified the place where the earth resisted differently, where the frost line behaved in a way that told you something had already been compressed and shaped beneath the surface. She did not begin by digging wide. She began by digging right. This was the first lesson Walt had given her on the subject of earth shelters, stated plainly and without decoration. The difference between a shelter that holds and one that collapses is not the amount of earth you remove. It is the quality of what remains. Every cut needed to preserve the compression of the surrounding soil. Every surface needed to be deliberate. Loose earth collapses, packed earth holds. These are not the same thing, and most people learn the difference at the wrong moment. She cut the entrance first offset from the natural fold of the hill, positioned so that it could not be seen from the most likely angles of approach, from the road below, from the ridge above, from either side. The entrance was narrow, lower than her waist, designed to require crouching. This was not a flaw. This was a feature. A low entrance retains heat. It also does not announce itself. The first hours were brutal. Her shoulders burned. Her hands blistered through the gloves before she thought to change them. The ground, though it had been worked before at depth, had partially settled and compacted over the years and required significant force to open. She stopped every 20 minutes to rest and drink water from the canteen she had filled at the creek, and to look at what she had done with the critical eye of a person who knows that wishful assessment at this stage costs you later. By late afternoon, she had opened a space roughly 8 feet wide and 5 feet deep with a ceiling that she had deliberately curved rather than flattened. Walt had been firm on this point. Flat ceilings collect condensation. Curved ceilings redirect it. The difference in a confined space over a long winter is the difference between wet and dry, and wet will kill you slower than cold, but it will kill you just as certainly. She stopped at dusk and covered the entrance with oilcloth weighted with stone, and ate without fire and slept inside the unfinished space wrapped in everything she had brought, listening to the wind move across the hill above her. The wind was loud above the hill. Inside, it was not loud. It was present slightly as a pressure change in the air, but not as sound, not as force. The earth absorbed it. She lay in the dark and felt the difference between the wind as she had heard it outside and the wind as she experienced it now, and the difference was so significant that she lay awake for a while simply noting it. This was what the hill was for, not to resist the weather, to be separate from it entirely. She had been working for 4 days when she found the older structure. She had moved deeper into the hillside following the natural line of the slope extending the main chamber toward the back, where the ground would be most stable. Her spade struck something that did not sound like stone and did not sound like undisturbed earth. She cleared around it carefully. A length of wood old darkened, set horizontally at a precise angle. Then another parallel positioned with intention. Then a section of packed earth so deliberately compressed that it could not have been natural, a wall, partial, unfinished, abandoned, but still structurally sound after what must have been decades. Agnes sat back on her heels and looked at what she had found. Walt Pruitt's unfinished work. She had known it was here in the abstract. Walt had told her. But knowing a thing and finding it with your own hands in the dark of a half-dug hillside are different experiences. And the difference hit her in a way she had not anticipated. He had been here. He had crouched in this exact space in some other autumn in some other year, and had done the same work she was doing now, cutting and shaping and compressing, planning for a winter he had ultimately not stayed to face. And then he had left, and the hill had kept his work safe for all the years between waiting without knowing it was waiting. Agnes pressed her hand flat against Walt's old wall. The wood was still sound. The packed earth around it was still tight. She had spent a lifetime not crying about things because crying required energy she needed for other purposes. But in that moment alone in the dark of a hillside in Wyoming in October 1889, she let herself cry. Not from grief exactly, not from relief, from the specific and overwhelming sensation of discovering that you are not as alone as you believe, that someone who is gone left something for you without knowing they were leaving it, that the ground itself had held a gift in trust for 40 years until you arrived to claim it. She cried for a short time. Then she wiped her face. Then she looked at Walt's old wall with professional attention and began to calculate how to build from it. On the 5th morning, she addressed the chimney. This was the part she had thought about most carefully because it was the part she could not make invisible. A fire requires ventilation. Ventilation produces smoke. Smoke produces questions. And questions in a small town in winter do not disappear on their own. She could not eliminate the smoke, but she could separate it from its source. The solution required patience and a willingness to do extra work that would not directly improve her comfort. She ran the flue not straight up from the fire position, which would have been simpler, but horizontally first through a natural rock formation that broke the hillside surface 20 feet to the north of the main chamber. The horizontal run required sealing with packed clay to prevent smoke from escaping into the earth. It required a surface exit that was disguised, not a pipe, not a seam, but a gap between 3 irregularly placed stones that looked exactly like the kind of gap that wind creates naturally over time. The smoke, when it rose, would emerge from a position that no one looking at the hillside would associate with the area she was actually living in. It would appear to come from empty ground because the ground it emerged from was empty. The actual source would be 20 feet away and several feet below the surface, and utterly undetectable from any angle of approach. A question without an answer she thought can persist longer than a visible truth. She knew the smoke would be seen. She had anticipated it. The town would notice because the town noticed everything unusual, and smoke on an empty hill was unusual. They would look. They would find nothing. And a question without an answer has a specific quality it nags, but it does not demand action the way a clear problem demands action. It could persist for weeks without forcing anyone to do anything definitive about it. She needed weeks. By the 8th day, she had enough. The structure was not complete. It would not be complete for several weeks more, but it was sufficient, a main chamber large enough to stand in at the center and to sleep in with room to spare, a ventilation system that functioned correctly, a fire that burned small because it was designed to maintain temperature rather than create it, and walls that were lined with layers of dried grass and salvaged hide, each layer trapping air, each layer slowing the movement of heat from inside to outside. She built a small fire that first evening inside the finished portion of the chamber and sat beside it and felt the temperature settle. Not warm, stable. There was a distinction, and the distinction mattered. Warmth was a spike easy to create and easy to lose. Stability was a condition harder to achieve but far more valuable over time because it compounded. Each hour at stable temperature required less effort to maintain than the one before it. The earth warmed slowly and, once warmed, released that heat slowly. And the net effect was a system that demanded less and less from her as the weeks passed. Above her, the wind ran across the hill without interruption. She felt none of it. Sheriff Amos Cole rode out to the hill on a Wednesday. He was a methodical man, 56 years old, with a wide face and careful eyes, in the particular bearing of a person who has spent 3 decades being the one people look to when things go wrong. He was not given to panic, and he was not given to imagination, which made him very good at his job and occasionally frustrating to talk to. He dealt in visible evidence and resisted conclusions that could not be verified. He rode directly to the base of the hill and dismounted and walked up the most direct line from the road, which was the logical approach, and also, though he did not know it precisely, the angle Agnes had accounted for. He moved slowly, scanning the slope, looking for disturbance, for inconsistency, for anything that would confirm what he already believed, that there was a structure here, poorly built, easily missed from a distance, but findable on close inspection. He found nothing. Snow crust, dry grass, stone, undisturbed ground in every direction. No depression where a floor might have been dug. No soil that showed the color change of recent excavation. No wood, no tool marks, no chimney, no door. He stood for a long time on the middle of the slope looking. The smoke was not rising because it was past mid-morning, and Agnes only maintained her fire in the early hours when the cold required it. The hill showed him nothing because the hill had been shaped to show nothing. Cole was not a man who gave up easily, but he was also not a man who refused to accept evidence. The evidence in front of him was absence, and absence in his experience was usually what it appeared to be. He descended, mounted, and rode back to town. "There's nothing on that hill," he said that evening in the front room of the general store, where men gathered in winter because it was warm and central, and the owner did not object. "Marsh gas or heat from stone, natural phenomenon." A man named Prescott nodded. Several others made sounds of acceptance. Silas Trent, who stood near the stove with a cup of coffee and said very little as a general rule, made no sound at all. Cole looked at him. "You have something to add?" Silas considered the question for a moment. He was a large man, 48, with a blacksmith's forearms and the particular quietness of someone who has learned that words are cheaper than observation. He had been the one to first take note of the smoke's regularity, its consistency, the fact that it appeared at the same interval each morning and disappeared at the same time. Not the smoke of a brush fire, not the smoke of something burning out, the smoke of something managed. "No," Silas said, but he did not nod. The town moved on to other concerns because winter had arrived in earnest now, and other concerns were plentiful. The temperature dropped steadily through November, not dramatically, but with the particular persistence of a Wyoming winter that has decided it will not moderate. Men checked their wood supplies and recalculated. Women sealed door frames and window edges with rags and oilcloth and anything else that would slow the transfer of cold from outside to in. Livestock was moved to more sheltered positions. Food stores were assessed. Harlan's Ridge prepared in the way it always had through effort. More fire and more wood, more work, more hours spent maintaining what the cold was constantly trying to diminish. This was the known method. It had worked before. People trusted it because it was familiar, and familiarity in the face of difficulty is its own kind of comfort, even when the method is imperfect. No one made the connection yet. No one placed the smoke and Agnes Marrow together in the same sentence, not publicly, not as a serious proposition. The town had watched her walk away and had made its assessment. She was gone, probably to Casper or to relatives somewhere, probably managing as well as could be expected, which was not very well, but that was not the town's concern. "She won't last the month," a man had said when she left. He had said it without particular cruelty, simply as a statement of practical likelihood. A woman of 64 alone without resources in the beginning of a Wyoming winter. But she had not appeared in Casper. No one who traveled that road in the weeks following had seen her on it, and the smoke continued each morning steady and unchanged. Silas Trent noted this. He noted it alone without speaking about it, and he continued to note it each day as November moved toward December, and the cold continued its work, and the smoke continued to rise from the empty hill to the west of town. He began to think about the hill, about the position of the smoke's emergence, about how far it was from where Agnes Marrow had walked when she left, about the specific direction she had taken, about what a 64-year-old woman who had spent her life on this land would know about it that most people did not. He thought about it carefully. He did not reach a conclusion quickly, but the smoke was consistent. And consistency in a Wyoming winter does not happen by accident. It means someone is there, and it means whoever is there knows exactly what they are doing. Outside the hill, the frost deepened. The days shortened. The wind that moved through Harlan's Ridge carried a different quality, now a steadiness, a pressure, a message that the weeks ahead would require more than the town had yet been asked to give. And every morning, without exception, the smoke rose from the empty hill, thin and gray and deliberate, and then dispersed, and then was gone, leaving nothing behind but the question it had always been. December came without ceremony. It arrived the way serious things often arrive, not with drama, not with a single dramatic drop that announces itself, but with a slow and steady increase in pressure that most people did not fully register until they were already inside it. The temperature fell 2 degrees one week, 3 degrees the next, and the wind that moved through Harlan's Ridge took on a different character, no longer variable, no longer rising and falling with the hours, but constant, directional, a pressure that pushed against every surface facing west and did not let up through the night. Men added wood to their fires earlier in the evening and found themselves adding more again before midnight. Women who had sealed their windows in November found new drafts appearing in December. Thin cold threads moving through spaces that should not have had spaces, through joints in the log walls that the frost was slowly working open as it expanded and contracted, an invisible, impatient force that would find every weakness given enough time. The town of Harlan's Ridge had survived worse winters. Everyone knew that and said it frequently because saying it helped. But knowing you have survived something before does not change the conditions of surviving it now, and the conditions in December of 1889 were making their demands known in ways that required constant response. Cobb Weller went through a third of his wood supply in the first 6 weeks of winter and calculated with some concern that his original estimate had been wrong, not by a small amount. He cut more rising before dawn to work before the morning deepened and the cold became unreasonable. He told his neighbor, who said the same had happened to him, and he had assumed it was his own error in calculation. Two men comparing the same miscalculation should have produced a conclusion, but it did not, because each man found it easier to attribute the discrepancy to his own planning than to something in the conditions that had not been accounted for. Silas Trent noticed. He noticed because noticing was what Silas did. He stood at the front of his smithy each morning before lighting his forge and watched the town with the specific attention of a man who has spent his professional life reading the behavior of metal under stress, understanding that the failure point is rarely where you expect it, that materials behave differently under sustained pressure than under sudden force, and that the slow accumulation of small changes is almost always more dangerous than any single event. What he saw in December was a town working harder than it should have needed to work. More fires burning longer, more wood being moved, stacked, restacked. Men's faces drawn not from cold alone, but from the particular fatigue that comes from effort that exceeds return, from pouring energy into a system that is losing more than it is gaining. He brought it to Cole on a Thursday afternoon, not as an accusation, not as an alarm, but as an observation stated plainly in the way Silas stated most things. He said the wood consumption across town is not matching the weather conditions. He said the winter is cold but not exceptional, and the rate of depletion suggests a structural problem, not a supply problem. He said the issue is not how much wood people have. The issue is how fast their shelters are losing what the wood produces. Cole listened with the patient expression he used when someone presented him with information he was not immediately sure how to use. He was a man who dealt well with problems that had clear shapes and clear solutions. A theft, a dispute, a structural failure with an obvious cause. Problems that required the application of expertise he already possessed. What Silas was describing was more diffuse, more systemic, and Cole's instinct when faced with diffuse problems was to simplify them until they became manageable. He said the winter was harder than it looked, and people had simply miscalculated. Silas considered this response for a moment. He did not argue. He had said what he came to say. He returned to his smithy and lit his forge and went to work because there was always work, and because he understood that some observations need to sit before they become useful. What Cole did not know, and what Silas suspected, but had not yet confirmed, was that the cabins in Harlan's Ridge had been built by men who understood winter as a force to be opposed, not as a condition to be separated from. They built thick walls and large fires, and they fought the cold with volume with mass, with the steady application of heat generated at significant cost. This method worked. It had always worked, but it worked expensively, and it worked only as long as the input could match the loss. The loss in a Wyoming winter with sustained directional wind was not small. Heat rose through roof lines that had not been designed to hold it. It moved through wall joints that the freeze-thaw cycle had enlarged by fractions too small to see. It escaped through every gap that had ever existed and through new ones that the winter itself was creating, and the net effect was that every cabin in Harlan's Ridge was in a constant state of hemorrhage, that the fires inside were working to compensate for which they could, but only barely, and only with continuous effort. The effort was not sustainable indefinitely. Silas understood this. Cole as yet did not. Below the hill to the west, Agnes Merrow understood it completely because she had built her shelter around the specific intention of not fighting that battle. The temperature inside her main chamber in early December held between 38 and 44 degrees. Not warm, but stable. Predictable. The fire she burned each morning so small, a fire a person looking from above would have described as inadequate, barely enough to warm a single room, let alone sustain a human life. But it was not trying to warm the space. It was replacing only what the space had lost, and the space lost very little, because the earth around it changed temperature, slowly releasing heat slowly, and the layers she had built into the walls slowed the transfer further. She had measured this deliberately in the weeks since she had moved in. She knew the temperature each morning before she lit the fire, and each evening after the fire had been out for hours. The range was narrow. The pattern was consistent, and consistency meant predictability, and predictability meant control, and control was the only thing that actually mattered when everything outside was variable and relentless. She spent her days in work that was quieter than the initial construction, but no less deliberate. She extended the rear of the main chamber, shaping a second space behind a natural wall of packed earth. This space she lined with extra care, additional layers, a higher ceiling to allow for standing. She did not rush it. She worked a few hours each day and rested when her body required it, and did not treat the need for rest as a failure because she was 64 years old. And she had made peace with the difference between what her body could do at 30 and what it could do now. And that peace had been one of the more useful things she had made in recent years. She thought about Walt while she worked, not in a sentimental way, not in the way of grief, but in the practical way of a student thinking through problems with a teacher's voice in mind. Walt had been a man of few words and many demonstrations, a man who showed rather than explained, who would stop in the middle of a task and simply wait for you to see what he was showing you rather than naming it. She had learned more from the silences in his instruction than from the words. She thought about his hands in particular, the way they moved over earth reading it, the way a doctor reads a patient with specific attention to what the material was telling him rather than what he expected it to say. She tried to use her own hands the same way. She pressed them flat against the walls of the chamber and read the temperature, the moisture level, the density, and she adjusted based on what she found rather than on what she had planned. Plans were starting points. The ground always had something to add. On the 14th of December, Cole rode back to the hill. He brought two men with him, this time Prescott and a younger rancher named Gideon Falk, and they approached from three different angles, spreading out across the slope to cover more ground and reduce the chance that whatever was there could be hidden from all of them simultaneously. They found nothing. Prescott came in from the north side and reported undisturbed snow across the entire upper third of the slope. Falk came up the eastern face and found the same unbroken ground, no paths, no depressions, no indication of repeated foot traffic. Cole took the direct approach again, the same line he had ridden in November, and this time he moved more slowly, stopping every few yards to examine the ground to listen to, look for the particular quality of settled snow that indicates something beneath the surface. He found nothing because Agnes had been placing her feet on the same stones each time she moved outside because the entrance was positioned on the far side of the natural fold in the hillside and was covered by oilcloth, weighted with stone that had been dusted with loose snow to match the surrounding surface. Because she had spent 2 years studying this hill and understanding which angles of approach were most likely and had shaped everything she built around that understanding. Cole climbed to the position he calculated was closest to where the smoke had appeared to originate. He stood there for some time. The wind moved across him steadily. The hill showed him the same undisturbed face it always showed. He did not know he was standing 4 feet above Agnes Merrow's head. She heard him. She heard the particular sound of boots on compacted snow, the slight creak of frozen ground accepting weight, the pause when he stopped moving, and she knew from the position of the sounds, from the way they tracked across the ceiling of her chamber, exactly where he was standing. She had not moved since she first heard them approaching. She lay still in the dark, breathing slowly, her hand resting on the packed earth beside her, feeling the slight vibration of each step above. He stood directly over her for what she estimated was 2 minutes. Then he moved on. She waited until she heard the horses descend before she exhaled fully. She lay still for another 10 minutes after that, not from fear, but because stillness was part of the system, and she had trained herself to maintain it past the point where it felt necessary, because the point where it felt unnecessary was often not actually the point where it was unnecessary. Cole told the town that evening that there was nothing on the hill, and that the smoke was a phenomenon he could not explain, but that unexplained phenomena were not crimes, and the matter was closed as far as he was concerned. Silas stood near the door and listened and said nothing. Later that night, he stood outside his smithy in the cold and looked toward the dark outline of the hill to the west, which showed nothing and offered nothing, and he thought about Agnes Merrow and what a woman of 64 who had spent her entire adult life on this land would know about it that most people here did not. He thought about the specific way she had looked when she walked out of the Merrow house 6 weeks ago. He had seen her do it. He had been crossing the street and had stopped and watched, and what he had seen was not a woman in shock, not a woman diminished, but a woman moving with the particular deliberateness of someone executing a decision they have already made completely. The bag in her hand had not been grabbed in haste. It had been packed with care. He thought about that bag for a long time. Then he went inside and put together what he could spare: a small amount of dried beef, a handful of matches, some salt wrapped in cloth. He tied the bundle and set it by the door. The following morning, before anyone else in town was moving, he rode out to the base of the hill and left the bundle in the notch of a specific stone at the hillside's edge. A stone visible from above on the slope, sheltered enough from the wind to keep the bundle in place. He did not leave a note. He was not certain she was there. He could not afford to be certain, because certainty would have required action he was not yet in a position to take. But he could afford to act on the possibility quietly without announcement, in the way that certain kinds of help work best. He rode back to town before the sun was fully up. 3 days later, when he returned to leave a second bundle, the first one was gone. He crouched beside the stone and looked at the spot where it had been, and felt something settle in his chest that he did not have a precise name for, but that was close to relief, close to confirmation, close to the particular satisfaction of an instinct that has been tested and found to be correct. He left the second bundle. He rode back to town. He said nothing to anyone. Agnes had found the first bundle on a morning when she needed it. Not desperately, not urgently, because she had planned well enough to avoid urgency, but the dried beef was better than what she had remaining, and the matches were a practical gift of significant value, and the salt was the kind of thing you do not realize you are missing until you have something worth salting. She had understood immediately who had left it. There were not many people in Harlan's Ridge who had the observational capacity and the specific discretion to do something like this. Silas Trent was the only name that fit all the conditions. She did not know how to return a communication to him without exposing her position. She did not try. She simply noted what he had done and kept it with her in the way she kept other things that mattered. Present but not displayed, part of the structure of how she understood her situation. From that morning forward, when she lit her small fire in the dark hours before dawn, she thought about Silas Trent and what it meant that someone was willing to act on a belief without demanding proof. It was a specific kind of faith, not the religious kind, but the kind between people who have watched each other long enough to know something true about the other person without being able to articulate exactly what that truth is. She was glad of it. She did not need it to survive, but she was glad of it, and she allowed herself to be glad without making it smaller than it was. December turned toward its end. The solstice passed, which meant the light would begin to return incrementally. barely noticeably but returned. Agnes noted it. She had always noted the solstice. Thomas used to say she was the only person he knew who considered the shortest day of the year a cause for optimism. And she had told him that a person who cannot find optimism in the fact that the worst is measurably past and every day forward is slightly better than the one before has not been paying attention. The town of Harlan's Ridge did not feel optimistic in late December. The man who died was named Rufus Colby. He was 51 years old and had lived alone in a cabin on the northern edge of town since his wife had passed 3 years prior. He was a self-sufficient man, which had been an asset for most of his life and became a liability in the end because there was no one to notice when his fire went low, no one to wake him when the temperature inside his cabin dropped past a survivable point in the 3 hours before dawn when cold does its most serious work. They found him in the morning. The town absorbed this in silence. It was not the first death in a Harlan's Ridge winter. It would not be the last. But there was a quality to this one that struck differently than previous losses. A recognition that Rufus Colby had been an experienced man who had done what he always did, and it had not been enough. And if it had not been enough for him, then the margin that everyone else was operating on was smaller than they had believed. Cole stood at the front of the general store that evening and said what needed to be said, that the winter was harder than usual, that people should check on their neighbors, that the wood supply needed to be monitored carefully. Reasonable things, responsible things, the things a man in his position was supposed to say. Silas noted that none of what Cole said addressed the underlying problem, that the underlying problem was structural, that checking on neighbors and monitoring wood supplies were responses to symptoms, not to causes, and that the cause, the steady and accelerating loss of heat from poorly designed shelters in sustained wind, was not going to respond to vigilance or community spirit. He did not say any of this out loud. He was a man who had learned the difference between what is true and what is useful to say in a given moment, and this was not the moment. Agnes heard none of this because she was below the hill, and the hill carried sound up and away from her. But she was aware of the passage of the weeks, aware of the mathematical relationship between time elapsed and conditions worsening, and she had been reading the world above her with the instruments available to her, which were the behavior of air pressure. In the chamber beam, the rate of moisture accumulation on the stone faces the specific quality of the cold that moved through the ventilation channel and several other indicators that a person learns to read only by paying sustained and specific attention to things most people do not think worth attention. In the third week of January, the tallow she used for her fire seal showed a change in behavior that she recognized. She had seen it twice before in her life, once in the winter of 1874 and once in 1881, and both times it had preceded the same thing, a significant atmospheric pressure event, what people in Wyoming called a blue norther, a storm system that did not behave like a normal winter storm, that did not rise and fall and pass in 2 or 3 days, but that settled, pressed down like a weight, and held for a duration that exhausted every normal calculation. The indicators were specific. The tallow behaved differently at certain pressure levels. The ventilation channel produced a slightly altered draft pattern when the barometric pressure began its particular pre-storm drop. The frost on the eastern interior wall appeared in a configuration she associated with the conditions that preceded sustained events. Walt had shown her these things. He had shown her without using the word barometric and without owning an instrument to measure pressure, because the instruments were the materials themselves if you knew what they were telling you. She began preparing immediately. She pulled additional fuel inside from the cache she had built into the rear of the main chamber. She packed the entrance more carefully, adding an extra layer of oilcloth, sealing the edges with the clay she kept for exactly this purpose. She checked every joint in the ventilation system, every seal on the horizontal run, every stone on the surface exit. She extended the second chamber's lining, working through the night with the careful efficiency of someone who has a deadline that cannot be negotiated. She did not hurry in the careless sense. She worked faster but no less precisely, because haste that introduces errors costs more than it saves. She moved enough food and water inside the sealed main chamber to sustain herself for 6 days. She thought about what was coming with the specific clarity that comes from recognizing a pattern you have seen before and understanding that recognition, in this case, was the single most valuable thing she possessed. The town did not see what was coming. Above her, in the final days of January, Harlan's Ridge continued its work, its daily calculation of wood and fire and warmth, its maintenance of systems that were already running closer to their limits. than most people had yet fully acknowledged. The sky looked the same as it had looked the week before. The temperature was cold, but not dramatically colder. There was nothing visible to suggest that what was coming was qualitatively different from what had already been survived. The smoke rose each morning from the empty hill, unchanged, steady, thin, dispersing by mid-morning, as it always did. Silas looked at it from the door of his smithy on the last morning of January and noticed something he had not noticed before, or had noticed and not allowed himself to name. The smoke was exactly the same every day. Not approximately the same, not roughly the same in a way that suggested it was being produced by someone who understood precisely how much to burn and for precisely how long, someone for whom the fire was not a comfort or a luxury, but a calculation, a precise and repeatable action that varied only within the range of what the conditions required. That kind of consistency does not come from luck. It comes from understanding, from the application of knowledge that is real and tested and reliable. He looked at the hill. He thought about Agnes Marrow and the bag she had carried and the direction she had walked. He thought about the second bundle he had left that had also disappeared. He thought about Rufus Colby. He looked at the sky, which told him nothing he could read. Agnes looked at the same sky from the entrance to her shelter and read it clearly. She went back inside. She sealed the entrance behind her. She set her fuel in order and checked her water and sat in the stillness of the chamber, the fire very low, and the walls holding their temperature and the wind just beginning to change its note. In the ventilation channel, a shift too subtle for most ears, but not for hers. She knew what was coming. She was ready. Outside the hill, the last light of January faded across Harlan's Ridge, and the temperature dropped another degree, and the wind held steady from the west, and no one in town slept easily, and the smoke that had risen each morning for 2 months had already told anyone willing to read it everything they needed to know about who was managing best and why. The question was no longer whether someone was on that hill. The question for the people paying closest attention had become something more urgent and more humbling. It was not how, it was not even why. It was what they did not know that she did, and whether, before the winter made its final claim, they would figure out how to ask. The storm arrived before dawn on the first day of February, not with the gradual buildup of a normal winter system, not with the warning hours of increasing wind and darkening sky that give people time to prepare and adjust. It arrived the way Agnes had known it would arrive, the way she had read in the tallow and the frost in the ventilation channel. All at once fully formed, as if it had been waiting just beyond the ridge and had chosen its moment with deliberate intention. The temperature dropped 11 degrees in 4 hours. The wind that had been pressing steadily from the west shifted and doubled, and what had been a constant pressure became a force that moved objects, that found gaps it had never found before, that worked its way into the spaces between things, with an urgency that the previous weeks of cold had not possessed. Snow came with it, not falling, driving horizontal, reducing visibility to the length of an outstretched arm within the first hour. Inside her chamber, Agnes heard it. She heard it the way you hear weather from underground, not as sound precisely, but as pressure, as a change in the behavior of the air in the sealed space around her. The ventilation channel, which she had sealed to its minimum functional opening the evening before, produced a different note, now a lower register, a sustained tone that told her the wind above was no longer variable. It had settled into something constant and serious. She did not move from where she sat. She had already done everything there was to do. The fuel was stacked and ordered. The water was inside and would not freeze. The entrance was sealed at 2 layers. The second chamber was ready. The fire was small and correctly positioned, and she had banked it with care so that it would hold through the hours when she chose not to tend it. She sat in the near dark with her hands folded and listened to the hill absorb the storm. The earth around her did not shake. The walls did not flex. The temperature inside the main chamber dropped 0.5 degree in the first 6 hours, which was within the range she had predicted, which meant the system was performing as it had been designed to perform. She added a small amount of fuel to the fire, precisely enough to compensate for what had been lost, not more, and settled back and let the structure do the work she had built it to do. Above her, Harlan's Ridge was not absorbing the storm. It was fighting it. The first indication of how serious the situation had become arrived when Prescott's roof began to fail before noon on the first day. The snow was not falling, it was accumulating on every horizontal surface with the density of wet concrete, and the roof of his cabin, which had been built with a slope angle that was sufficient for normal Wyoming winters, was not sufficient for the rate of accumulation that the storm produced in its first hours. The structure gave slowly a series of sounds that Prescott later described as a long, low conversation that he did not understand until the ceiling came down on the eastern side. He survived. He made it to the general store with his face white and his hands shaking from something that was not entirely cold. Word moved through the remaining structures fast the way word moves when people are frightened enough to stop editing what they know before they say it. 2 more roofs were identified as suspect. Men moved between buildings in pairs, which was the only safe way to move in visibility that had dropped to nearly nothing, and they did so quickly and returned quickly because time outside in those conditions was not measured in comfort, but in survival margin. The fires burned harder. That was the instinct, and it was not wrong exactly, but it was not right either, because burning harder meant consuming faster, and the supply that had already been running below comfortable levels was now being drawn down at a rate that several men did the mental arithmetic on and arrived at conclusions they did not immediately share with their wives. Cole moved through the town with the purposefulness of a man who understands that leadership in a crisis means being seen to act whether or not the action is addressing the actual problem. He organized the vulnerable households, the elderly, the families with young children, into the more structurally sound buildings. He assessed the remaining wood supply with Prescott and 2 others. He kept people calm by keeping people moving, which is a legitimate strategy and one he had used before and believed in. But Silas watched the wood pile in the center of the general store getting smaller and made his own calculation. He was not wrong about the wood. He was also thinking about something else. He was thinking about the smoke that had not risen that morning because the storm had covered everything, and the world above the hill was the same white wall as the world above the town, and for the first time in 2 months, he could not see it, and the absence of it made him understand more clearly than its presence ever had what it had been telling him. It had been telling him that someone out there was managing correctly, that someone out there had solved a problem the town had not yet admitted it had. And now the problem had arrived at full scale, and the town was responding with the tools it had always used, and those tools were going to run out before the storm did. He found Cole on the second day mid-morning, when the wind had not diminished and the temperature outside had not risen, and the wood in the general store was down by 1/3 from where it had been when the storm began. He said, "We need to find Agnes Marrow." Cole looked at him for a moment. He was a tired man by that point, 2 days without adequate sleep, the particular fatigue that comes from sustained decision-making in conditions that penalize error. He was not at his most resistant. He said, "You think she is on that hill?" Silas said, "I know she is on that hill." Cole said, "We do not know that." Silas said, "I have been leaving supplies at the base of the hill for 6 weeks. Every bundle has been taken. Someone is up there, and we both know who it is, and we both know that if she has survived 2 months on that hill, then she knows something about surviving on that hill that we do not. And right now, that knowledge is the most valuable thing within 40 miles of this building." Cole was quiet for a time. Outside, the wind continued its work. Someone across the room said something about the roof, and 3 men got up to look. Cole looked at the ceiling above him, then back at Silas. He said, "How do we find it?" Silas said, "I have been watching the smoke for 2 months. I know the position within 30 yards. Cole nodded. He did not say he had been wrong. He did not say he should have listened earlier. Those were statements for a different kind of moment, and this was not that moment. He simply nodded and reached for his coat. They went in a group of 5. Cole and Silas, and 3 men who were younger and stronger, and whose presence improved the odds of getting back if the conditions on the exposed hillside proved worse than they anticipated, which they did. The walk from the general store to the base of the hill was 160 yards on a clear day. In the storm, it took 35 minutes. They moved in a line with the front man using a long fence post to probe the ground ahead, because the snow had covered familiar terrain to a depth that removed all the usual markers. The stones, the fence lines, the path edges, and without those markers, a man could walk in a circle in that visibility and never know it. Silas led. He had committed the direction to memory over weeks of early morning observation. The specific angle from his smithy door to the base of the hill, the landmarks that fell along that line, and he used them now from memory because he could not see them. He counted steps and adjusted for the wind's push and kept moving with the particular determination of a man who has decided that the cost of stopping is higher than the cost of continuing. The hill was worse than the flat ground. The wind hit them directly as they climbed because the hill's south-facing curve, which sheltered it from the prevailing west wind in normal conditions, funneled the storm's altered direction straight into their path. Men leaned into it and climbed with their heads down and their eyes reduced to slits, and their hands working the frozen ground for purchase. Silas moved toward the position he had identified. He slowed when he judged they were close. He dropped to his knees and began clearing snow with his forearms, wide, sweeping movements that moved large amounts quickly but without precision, and then shorter movements as he worked closer to the ground. And then he was using his bare hands because gloves did not give him the sensitivity he needed. And the coal was significant and immediate, and he did not stop. He found stone, not scattered stone, placed stone, 3 flat pieces in a configuration that no frost heave or water movement would have produced, an arrangement that had the specific quality of human intention, of a mind that had considered the placement and made a decision. He struck the top stone with his fist. The sound that came back was wrong in the right way. The way a sound is wrong when there is a hollow space beneath the surface, a resonance that open ground does not have. He struck again harder. Then he waited. The wind above them was loud enough that he was not certain he would hear anything beneath it. He pressed his ear close to the stone and waited. A sound, movement, something shifting. Then the stone moved. It moved inward and down, drawn from below, and with it came a seam of light orange and warm, and completely unlike the gray-white world above. And then the seam became an edge, and the edge became an opening. And the warmth that came out of it was not dramatic. It was not a wave of heat. It was subtle and steady, and it moved across their faces like something remembered. Agnes was there. She stood just inside the entrance, her head slightly lowered because the ceiling at the entrance point was deliberately low. And she looked at the 5 men crouching in the snow above her with the expression of someone who has been expecting visitors and is noting that they have arrived more or less on schedule. She said, "You found it." Not a question, a statement, an acknowledgement. Cole was the first one to find words. He said, "Mrs. Merrow." She looked at him steadily and then looked at the others, and then she stepped back and gestured for them to come in a simple movement of her hand, practical and without ceremony. They came in one at a time, crouching through the entrance, straightening as the ceiling height permitted, and each one stopped when he got fully inside because the inside was not what any of them had imagined. The main chamber was larger than it appeared possible from the entrance. The ceiling curved above them in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. The walls were layered with materials that were clearly not random grass compressed under hide, overlapping at the joints, a system of insulation that had been constructed with the same attention to detail that a good cabinet maker brings to joinery. The floor was covered with a layer of dry material that had been leveled and maintained. The fire was small, smaller than any of them would have considered sufficient, but the chamber was warmer than the general store they had left, and the warmth was not the spiky, variable warmth of a large fire being fought by drafts. It was even ambient, the warmth of a space that was simply holding its temperature as a natural condition. There was no wind. That was the thing that struck them in sequence, each man registering it at a slightly different moment. Outside the wind was a physical force that required active resistance. Inside this space, it did not exist. Not diminished, not reduced, absent. The hill around them absorbed it completely, and what remained was stillness, a quality of air that none of them had experienced in weeks and that their bodies responded to before their minds caught up. Silas straightened to his full height and looked at the walls and then at the ceiling and then at Agnes, and his expression was not surprise exactly, but something close to the feeling that arrives when a conclusion you have worked toward over a long period of time is confirmed by direct evidence, a satisfaction that is quiet because it was never really in doubt. Cole looked at everything more slowly. He was a methodical man, and he was looking with professional attention, the attention of someone trying to understand a system rather than simply observe it. He looked at the fire and at the position of the ventilation channel and at the angle of the walls and at the way the materials had been layered, and he understood gradually with the particular experience of a man seeing something for the first time that should have been obvious, that everything in this space had been built to serve a function, and that every function was related to every other function, and that the result of all those related functions was a space that required very little to sustain. Agnes watched him look. She did not explain. She let him see. Then she moved to the rear of the chamber and pushed aside a section of layered hide that had been fitted into the wall and gestured for them to follow. Behind it was the second chamber. It was wider than the first, taller, lined with even greater care. There were places along the walls where bedding materials had been laid out, not casually, deliberately, in positions that suggested they had been placed with the specific intention of accommodating people. The space could hold 8, comfortably by the standards of what comfort meant in a Wyoming winter in 1889. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Cole said, "You built this for us." Agnes considered the statement. Then she said, "I built it because I understood what the winter would do. What you do with it is your decision." It was not a rebuke. It was a statement of position of what she had done and why, without any claim on what it meant or what was owed. She had built the space because she had understood the need, and she had understood the need because she had been paying attention to the conditions that most people in Harlan's Ridge had been managing around rather than solving. Cole sat down slowly on the earthen ledge along the wall. He was a large man, and the sitting looked effortful, the movement of a body that has been carrying significant weight for too long. He sat and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor of the chamber for a time. Then he said, "I told the town there was nothing on this hill. I said it more than once." Agnes said, "You said what you found. You did not find anything." Cole said, "Because you built it, so I would not." She looked at him directly. She said, "Yes." There was no softening in that. She had built it so he would not find it, because she had needed weeks without interference, and she had understood that the only way to have those weeks was to make herself unfindable. What she had built was invisible, not by accident, but by design, by the application of understanding to every decision. And if that understanding had made Cole look insufficient, that was not something she was going to minimize to make him more comfortable. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, something more complicated. He said, "How long have you been planning this?" She said, 2 years. He absorbed that. The 3 other men had settled into the second chamber by now, not in the posture of men resting, but in the posture of men whose bodies have made a decision independent of their minds, the slow release of muscles that have been held tight for too long. One of them, a young rancher named Decker, had his eyes closed and his head back against the wall, and his breathing had already slowed into something that resembled sleep. Silas remained in the main chamber with Agnes and Cole. He stood near the fire and looked at it with the professional attention of a man who works with heat for his living and was understanding in technical terms what he was seeing. He said nothing. He simply looked. Dale arrived on the second day. He came with 2 others from town who had been directed to the hill by Cole after Cole had returned briefly to organize the movement of the most vulnerable people. Dale was among the group that came in the second wave, and he came because there was no longer any alternative, because the cabin he and Vera had been using on the Merrill property had developed a problem with its eastern wall, and the temperature inside had dropped to the point where continuing to stay was no longer a rational choice. He descended through the entrance without speaking. He straightened in the main chamber and looked at the space with the expression of a man who is experiencing several contradictory things simultaneously and has not yet decided which one to be. Vera came in after him. She stopped when she cleared the entrance and stood upright, and the warmth of the space reached her face, and she closed her eyes for a moment with an involuntariness that she clearly had not intended. Agnes was tending the fire at the back of the main chamber. She looked up when they came in. She and Vera regarded each other across the space. It was not a long look. It was not a dramatic one. There was no declaration in it, no accusation, no performance of forgiveness or its absence. It was simply 2 women looking at each other with the particular clarity that arrives when the conditions have stripped away everything that is not essential, when the cold has removed the luxury of pretense, and what remains is only what is true. Vera looked at the walls. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the fire and the way the chamber held its temperature and the layered materials and the evidence of months of deliberate and skilled work. She looked at all of it, and then she looked at Agnes, and she did not say anything. She did not need to. Agnes moved to give her a place to sit, not a gesture of forgiveness, a gesture of function. There was space, and there were people who needed to be in it, and the management of that space was something Agnes understood and was going to continue to do regardless of who occupied it. Dale sat against the far wall and did not speak for a long time. The storm held for 4 days. Inside the hill, those 4 days had a quality unlike anything the men and women who experienced them had previously encountered. It was not comfortable in the way that their normal lives were comfortable. It was close and dim, and the sounds of the storm were present as a background presence that reminded them constantly of what was happening outside. There was not enough space for everyone to lie down simultaneously. The food was rationed carefully. The water had to be managed, but the temperature held. That was what none of them had fully believed possible until they experienced it directly. The temperature inside the chambers held through 4 days of the worst conditions any of them could remember, without a large fire, without constant tending, without the frantic effort that had characterized the weeks in town. It held because the system was designed to hold it, and a system that is designed correctly does not require heroic effort to function. It simply functions. Agnes moved through the space with a quietness that was different from the quietness of someone trying not to disturb others. It was the quietness of someone who is in a place they understand completely, whose actions are small and precise because they have been thought through and require nothing more than what they are. She tended the fire at correct intervals. She monitored the ventilation. She checked the entrance seal at the end of each day and adjusted what needed adjusting. She managed the fuel with the precision of someone who has counted it and knows exactly what each piece is worth. Cole watched her. He watched her the way he had looked at the chamber on the first night, with the attention of a man trying to understand a system. He watched her move, and he watched the effects of her movements, and he began to understand imperfectly but genuinely the relationship between what she did and why the space worked the way it did. On the third day, he asked her a question. He asked her how she had known the storm was coming before it arrived. She told him about the tallow. She told him about the ventilation channel and what changes in its behavior indicated about atmospheric pressure. She told him about the frost pattern on the eastern wall and what that specific configuration meant. She told him about Walt Pruitt and what he had shown her over years of conversation that was never formal and never declared itself as instruction, but that had transferred something real and usable from one person to another. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "Have been sheriff of this county for 11 years. She waited. He said, "I thought I knew this land." She said, "You know it from above." Walt taught me to know it from inside. He looked at the walls around them. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the fire. He did not say anything else, but something in his face changed in a way that was permanent. Not shame exactly. Understanding. The specific and irreversible understanding that arrives when you have been shown the gap between what you knew and what you thought you knew, and the gap is large enough that you cannot pretend it is not there. Silas spent most of the 4 days in a quiet work of his own. He examined the structural elements of the chambers with a craftsman's attention, the way the wood had been used in the wall framing, the angle of the ceiling curve, the placement and spacing of the ventilation elements. He did not ask Agnes to explain. He looked until he understood, and when he did not understand, he looked longer. On the 4th day, the wind dropped. It dropped over a period of several hours, not suddenly but progressively, the way a force that has spent itself finally concedes. The pressure in the ventilation channel changed. The background note that had been present for 96 hours resolved downward and then disappeared. The storm was not over, but it was ending, and the ending had its own quality that was as readable as the beginning had been to someone who was paying attention. Agnes said it is passing. No one asked how she knew. They came out into a world that was the same and different simultaneously. The sky was the color of old pewter, flat and still after days of driven white. The snow had settled to a depth that changed the shape of the land-filling hollows, rounding edges, covering the markers that people navigate by, until the landscape had the unfamiliar quality of a familiar place seen under new conditions. The cold was serious, but static now, not moving, not pushing, simply present. Harlan's Ridge was visible from the hill. They could see it clearly in the still air, the roof lines and the smoke rising from the buildings that had held, and the gaps where buildings had not held, and the general altered look of a settlement that has been tested at a level it had not anticipated. Cole stood at the entrance of the hill and looked at it for a long time. Then he turned to Agnes and said that he wanted her to come back. He said it formally, which was how he said things that he meant seriously. He said that the town owed her an accounting of the property situation and that he was prepared to be part of making that right, that what Dale had done with the document was a matter that deserved proper review, and that he believed she had a legitimate claim that had not been properly considered. Agnes listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking. Then she said, Amos, I am 64 years old. He waited. She said, I spent 40 years living in a way that other people decided was correct. I kept a house that was not legally mine, and a relationship with a stepson who did not want me, and a position in a town that was polite to me because Thomas stood next to me. I kept all of it because it was what was available, and because I believed that what was available was what I was entitled to want. She paused. She looked at the hill around her, at the entrance, at the walls visible just inside. She said, this winter, I built something. I built it alone out of knowledge I had spent years accumulating, and it worked. It worked better than what the town had, and I knew it would work not because I was lucky, but because I understood what I was doing. And that understanding is mine. I own it completely. No document can take it. No one can come and say it belongs to someone else. She looked at Cole directly. She said, I do not want to give that back. Cole held her gaze. He was a man who had spent his life being the authority in the room, and he was standing in front of a 64-year-old woman on a hillside in Wyoming after a blizzard, and she was not asking his permission for anything, and he understood that and respected it and had nothing to say that would change it. He nodded. Dale had come out during this exchange and stood several feet away. He had heard. He did not speak. What he might have said did not matter, and he seemed to know it. Vera stood beside him and looked at Agnes and then looked away at the town below, and her face had the expression of a person working through a calculation they had thought was simple and had found to be more complex than anticipated. The others moved off toward town in small groups, walking carefully through the deep snow, following the path that Cole had marked with sticks on the way up. They moved slowly and they spoke quietly to each other, and several of them looked back at the hill as they descended. Silas was the last to leave besides Cole. He stopped beside Agnes before he went, and he looked at her for a moment in the direct and uncomplicated way that he looked at most things. Then he reached into his coat and produced a key on a short cord. He held it out. She looked at it. He said, that is the key to the storage room behind the smithy. There is a winter's worth of smoked meat and dried provisions in there that I have not needed because I planned well, and the storm was 4 days and not 40. You are welcome to it. All of it. No conditions. She took the key. She said, thank you, Silas. He nodded. He turned and walked down the hill. Cole lingered for another moment. He looked at the entrance to the hill, at the stones that had been placed with such care at the oilcloth and the seals and the evidence of months of skilled and deliberate work. He said, you knew all winter. You knew what the storm would do before it did it. She said, yes. He said, why did you not warn us? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I was not in a position to warn anyone. I was a woman living on a hill in an arrangement that most of the town had decided was impossible. If I had come down from this hill in November and told you that the winter would require changes to the way you were building your fires, you would have listened politely and then ridden back out here to look for the structure you had already decided did not exist. He looked at the ground. She said, people learn from conditions, Amos, not from advice. The conditions arrived, and now you have learned. That is the right order. He looked up at her. He said, and next winter, she said, come and find me in October. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked down the hill, following the tracks the others had made in the snow. Agnes stood at the entrance to her hill and watched them go. She watched until the last figure had descended to the flat ground below and joined the others moving toward town until they were small against the white landscape and then indistinct and then gone absorbed back into the settlement they had built and heated and fought to maintain through the winter that had just broken. She looked at the town for a time, at the smoke rising from the surviving buildings, at the altered roof lines and the stillness that follows a storm when the world is assessing what it has lost and what it has kept. Then she looked at the hill around her, at the stone and the frozen grass and the entrance that was invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. At the work of 2 years made real in earth and wood and packed clay, and every lesson Walt Pruitt had ever shown her in pieces across decades of quiet conversation. She had been 64 years old when the winter began. She was still 64 years old, but the winter had changed the meaning of that number in a way she had not fully anticipated. Not because she had survived, survival alone was a modest achievement, but because she had survived correctly, had understood the conditions and built the response and executed it alone, and it had worked, and she knew why it had worked, and that knowledge would not diminish with the season. Spring would come. It always came. The snow would retreat from the hillside in stages, revealing the ground beneath in the specific order that the sun and drainage dictated. The entrance to her shelter would become easier to manage. The temperature inside would rise as the earth around it absorbed the season's warmth. The fire she burned each morning would become smaller still, and then perhaps unnecessary, and the skills she had used to survive the cold would adapt to the different requirements of the months ahead. But the knowledge would remain. That was the thing about knowledge, that is genuinely earned knowledge, that has been tested at full scale under conditions that do not forgive error. It does not depreciate. It does not become less true when the conditions that proved it have passed. It sits in a person the way Walt Pruitt's work had sat in the hill, waiting in the dark, available when needed as sound in the present as it had been in the moment it was made. She went back inside. She pulled the entrance closed behind her and sealed it with the care she always used. Not because the storm was still a threat, but because careful sealing was correct, and correct was how she did things, not in moments of crisis only, but as a general condition of how she moved through the world. The fire had dropped while they were outside. She added to it precisely and positioned herself beside it and felt the chamber return to its temperature in the unhurried way it always did. The wind outside had stopped. The hill above her was silent for the first time in 4 days, and that silence had a quality she recognized as something close to completion, the specific quality of a system that has done what it was built to do, and is now simply existing, neither straining nor idle, simply present and functional and sufficient. She sat beside the small fire in the hill she had built with her own hands and her own knowledge, and the inherited wisdom of a man who had understood the land before the land had a town on it. Outside, the smoke would rise again tomorrow morning, thin, gray, steady, rising from a hill that showed nothing and offered no explanation. And the people of Harlan's Ridge would look at it from their repaired buildings and their adjusted fires, and they would understand it differently than they had before. Not as a mystery, not as a provocation, not as evidence of something that did not make sense. They would understand it as a direction. They would understand it as the mark of someone who had solved a problem they were still learning to name, who had built her solution into the earth itself, and then waited with the patience of someone who knew that the winter would eventually make her point. For her, who had decided at 64 years old that the life she had been given was not the only life available to her, and had gone out and built another one in the most literal sense possible. With her hands in the ground on a hill no one would have looked at twice. The smoke would biremis. The hill would hold, and Agnes Merrow would tend her fire in the stillness below, the same as she had done every morning since October, the same as she would do every morning that followed, in the way of someone who has found the work that is exactly right for them and intends to continue it for as long as they are able, which, if the winter had taught the town anything, was likely to be longer than anyone had previously calculated.